His Excellency, the President of Niger, who's here with us. So we will be resuming our conversation today. So it's my pleasure today to host and moderate the panel session titled Towards a New Partnership with Africa. And I think it's an interesting title because it fits with the general DNA and outlook of the DOC Forum, which is all about constructive dialogue between world nations and actors. So what we are looking at today is a continent that is budding with transformations and increasing access to new technologies, as well as fast demographic growth and densely populated urban areas. Those are all phenomena that can contribute to challenges, but also translate into opportunities. Now, what we see is that African nations are increasingly fostering deeper social, economic, and political ties amongst themselves and looking inwards for development, meaning that dependence on global aids and subscription to copy-pasting Western models seem like narratives of the past. But are African partners actually taking those changes into account, and can we effectively use new economic partnership models to achieve sustainable growth? Those are questions that we're going to lay on the table today with all of our panelists, and we're going to do it in a very genuine way. But before I announce the different panelists, I'm going to thank the President, le Président du Niger qui est avec nous aujourd'hui. Je vais passer au français. Merci beaucoup de nous joindre, Monsieur le Président, et la délégation du Niger également. That the President will be giving concluding remarks at the end of our session today. Now, I will welcome our esteemed panelists. First, former Prime Minister or Prime Minister of Guinea, Kabiné Komara. Can you please join me on stage? And can you please welcome him, ladies and gentlemen? Mr. Jaime Graça of the international investment firm based in Angola, ABO Capital. Thank you very much for being with us as well. Dr. Peter Eigen, Chair of the Advisory Council of the Transparency International, is also with us. Thank you for welcoming him as well. We have Ivor Ichikowitz, I hope I'm saying your name well, founder and executive chairman of the South African Parliament Paramount Group, which operates in global defense and peacekeeping. And last but not least, Jean-Yves Ollivier, president of the Brazzaville Foundation. Thank you very much for being with us as well. So ladies and gentlemen, we'll have a bilingual panel today because some of our panelists are French speakers, some others are Anglophones. So please use your translating device to be able to understand and grasp everything that's going on here. And we will try to keep with time. We were slightly late, but we will try to talk about as many topics as we can with our panelists today. Hello and welcome to all of you. So I will start by setting the stage and just ask you a very simple, straightforward question. And I would like for each of you to briefly tell us how you feel about the current framework of partnerships between world nations and African nations. Maybe starting with you, Monsieur le Premier Ministre. Quelle vision avez-vous des partenariats qui sont engagés entre...
What vision do you have of the partnership between world countries and African countries? Thank you very much for this question. I'd like to thank very much the organizers of this forum for having invited us. And I'd like also to thank the President for being here. He is an example for all of us in Africa. Now, what I'd like to say in relation to the partnership between Africa and the rest of the world is not a one-way street. Africa is a huge area and has received a lot of investments and financing, and today it has become more mature. Now, in each country you can see the best practices that can be reproduced. Now, we've seen what is good in relation to the Chinese development. We have seen Brazil, we have seen India. Now, African countries have gone beyond the colonial system and we have progressed. Now, the world is facing new challenges and new dimensions.
Feel the same way as the Prime Minister of former Prime Minister of Guinea, that we're looking at more dynamic relations with the rest of the world, and because we're in this multipolar world today, it's much more beneficial for African countries.
I think that Africa is facing one of the most exciting times in history. For all the reasons that the Prime Minister has just outlined, we are in a position where we have young leadership in Africa, dynamic leadership in Africa, that has come to the realization that our future is in our own hands. The old Africa was about donations, it was about aid, it was about looking to the West for its salvation. The new Africa is about entering into strong partnerships where Africans take the lead, where we determine the rules, and our partners get the benefit of co-investing with us on the continent. And I think that we are facing the real African Renaissance right now. You know, the next scramble for Africa is about to happen. The talk around the African trade agreement has created a huge amount of excitement, and we've all lived through it before. We've all seen the various scrambles for Africa, and we're just on the cusp of a new scramble for Africa. But this one's going to be different, and it's going to be different because we as Africans are going to lead the way. We're never going to allow ourselves to be a colonial environment again. Young Africans will not put up with that. And we're now in a position, because of the investment that's been made in Africa, because of the advancements that has been made in Africa, because of visionary leadership like the President's, we've got a new generation of success stories in Africa, so we can stand for the first time in a long time, toe to toe with partners that are going to help us go to the next stage of development.
A lot of optimism from your side as well, as I can tell. Mr. Graça, would you say that you feel the same way about the current framework of partnerships as an Angolan and as someone who also works in Africa?
Yes, totally agree. Africa future is now. We have new presidents, we have young people that can become our challenges today as a demography. We can turn in a big opportunity. Because of that, Africa, for example, will double your population in 2050, but we can look for this as a good opportunity. For example, for healthcare, Africa will become the second large market for healthcare. So we have young people, young leadership with too much tools to become a big Africa today.
Monsieur Jean-Yves Ollivier, alors vous travaillez en Afrique depuis...
Sir, you have been working in Africa for several years now. Now, what can you tell us in relation to relationship between the various African countries? Now, I can only agree with what has been said so far by Prime Minister Komara and the other honorable guests around this table. Now, the change is fundamental when we talk about partnerships. So far, it was rich countries that were coming to Africa saying, this is what you have to do. That's how you'll deal with this problem. Now, Africans say, we decide what we're going to do. And we are ready to ask for your assistance. And therefore, we do not want to be any longer under anybody's thumbs.
If you could answer the same question, please, Professor Eigen.
Well, I am very, very pleased to agree with the people who spoke before me. And I'm very happy to be able to speak in front of Your Excellency, the President of Niger, and thank you very much for being invited. But unfortunately, I have to probably put a little drop of caution into this optimistic outlook for Africa. Mm-hmm. We are in a situation where the problems of Africa are immense. I'm not only talking about climate change, I'm talking about blood and conflict in many parts of Africa. I'm talking about international conflicts in many situations, and very low natural resources prices. So yes, there is a new Africa, there is a new determination, but I've heard that before. I've heard that when I was the director of the World Bank office in Nairobi. I heard that in the Berke report. Everybody said there's a young generation of Africans who are waiting to decide themselves for Africa what they want to do. I remember tremendous initiatives in Africa, like NEPAD, like the APRM. I mean, these are all things which empower Africa to take things into their own hands. I remember from the same time the work of the Global Coalition for Africa, where powerful African leaders got together with a few people from the north, like Minister Pronk, like President McNamara, and so on, from the World Bank. But I also see that there is a new determination right now and a new potential, but the challenges are tremendous. And I served for the last 10 years on the Africa Progress Panel, which has been created at Glen Eagles in order to create a common strategy for Africa. A common strategy not only determined by the Africans, but also by the friends of Africa and the partners of Africa. And under the leadership of Kofi Annan, we worked for 10 years in various sectors trying to find solutions to the problems which were coming to all of us. And I think we have made a lot of progress. I see a lot of the potential which has been mentioned by all of you. But I also see that there is a tremendous workload still ahead of us. So I feel, yes, there are now concepts, there are models for African development which are being designed partly by the African Union, partly by the intellectuals and leaders and so on in Africa, partly by the African Development Bank and so on. But I also see that we need a world which responds to this and is willing to make investments and contributions in Africa. And for that, we need a concept which bridges between the interests and the agendas and so on of the North and the friends of Africa, outside Africa, and the Africans who, of course, are now in charge and have a very powerful role right now.
So, Professor Eigen, you clearly are talking about caution, and you mentioned a few of the endemic and systemic problems that we have across the continent, and you are very to bring these up. But I want to focus now and touch on those partnerships that we just mentioned. And I think that what the discourse that we've heard in recent years is that Africa is striving for win-win partnerships that will be a little bit more beneficial for the countries that are receiving all those FDIs and those investors. I want to maybe ask what kind of win-win partnership we're seeing today that you think, maybe starting with you, Jaime, Graça, that you think are sustainable models that can be maybe replicated in other African countries and that should be sustained in order to have this win-win partnership going on?
Yes. In Africa, last two decades, the trade in Africa doubled. Today, I think, is 4 times more, and we need actually more strong partnership. We have some countries that are more able than others to do that because many of these countries have solved some basic issues like health, education, energy, but I think all of them try to follow up to get good results.
So, Ivor, sorry, I'm going to get there. Ichikowitz, can you name a few win-win partnerships that you have noticed or witnessed in maybe South Africa and other African countries that you think are beneficial to African countries?
So I get to talk about the real elephant in the room. I've just had the privilege of an interview with China television.
Yeah.
And the interviewer said to me, he said, there is this perception that we have tried to colonize Africa. Do you believe that China is trying to colonize Africa? And I said to him, absolutely not. The China partnership with Africa is one of the first real success stories on the African continent. When the rest of the world ignored us, when Africa needed the rest of the world most, when Africa needed the North most, the North didn't believe in us at all, and they left us to our own devices. And the Chinese stepped in, and they made a contribution which changed completely the complexity of the continent. They made real investments in the billions of dollars. They put their money where their mouth is, because they were not talking about policy and transparency and structural problems and all of the issues of Africa. The world talks about the problems of Africa, and Peter, you're 100% correct. We have problems, but you created the problems. The problems were created by the North. And we're now in a situation where we have to fix all of that. We have to fix all that those structural issues. And the Chinese stepped in and said, we accept you have problems. We've got cash. We've got the ability to help you to create infrastructure. And they turned the tide of the continent. And the current scramble for Africa that we're seeing now is the rest of the world turning around and saying, while we were sleeping, the Chinese have stolen the march. And thank heavens they did. Thank heavens they did, because otherwise the continent today would be in an exponentially worse situation than it currently is.
Very strong position there from Mr. Ichikowitz about how China has looked at the continent and really helped develop it when the North was looking elsewhere. I feel like Professor Eigen would like to react to just the mention that we should not always look at the structural problems, but also not prescribe transparency, solutions, and methods, but just maybe allow for development to occur and economic development to occur.
Well, to a large extent, I agree with what Ivor says. In particular, the systematic corruption of African leaders was driven by the offers of corruption from Germany, from the UK, from France, from the United States, from Japan, and so on. This is why when I started Transparency International, my focus was mainly on how to stop these companies from bribing relatively fragile African governments to take the wrong decisions on major projects, to take the wrong decisions on their economic policies. And I think we were quite successful. We managed to get the OECD Convention Against Foreign Bribery on the books. We managed to get the UN convention, even the World Bank, which had fired me earlier because I wanted to fight corruption. Even the World Bank is now a tremendous anti-corruption fighter. And I also agree with you that it was very welcome that the Chinese came into Africa. Finally, there was an alternative to the relationships which still existed of many of the powerful leaders in Africa with their former colonial masters. So in many ways, we all welcomed that. But I also remember the time when, say, the Minister of Finance of Ghana told me, we have learned our lesson. We have seen how damaging corruption is, for instance, for our economic development. And therefore, when we are dealing now with the Chinese, we are going to avoid what has happened in the past. And unfortunately, this is not happening. So I'm very happy to see that many of you think that these impositions, these conditionalities and so on, which were imposed also by the World Bank and the IMF, that these are not necessary anymore. I personally feel it would be very good if we would focus on governance in Africa. We would focus on the capacity of African leaders to negotiate better deals with, for instance, investors from the North, investors from China. And so on. So, this is why I believe we should not think that this is all now taking off without a lot of effort. There will be a tremendous effort to maintain what Africa has achieved in terms of better governance, more openness, and many countries were not corrupt. I personally worked in Botswana in the 70s, and I'm very proud that they are not affected to the same degree by grand corruption, which is, as you say correctly, are very often carried into the countries from the outside world. So I join you in your congratulatory mood right now that Africa is able to start afresh. But I also would like to remain very vigilant, partly because I have heard this so many times in the past that everything is starting afresh, and I remember the Berg report in the 1980s, you know, where they said, now we are taking our fate into our own hands,
Yeah.
and we have seen what has happened since. Yeah.
Monsieur le Premier ministre, Professeur Eigen, ainsi.
Prime Minister, you heard about the governance, about the need for transparency in order to truly be certain that there will be an all-inclusive development in Africa that will open the doors to partnerships. Now, it's difficult to answer for the entire continent. However, do you think you are following this track? Well, I'm sure you have already noted that in Africa we have more and more democratically elected governments. You see that we have developed institutions that ensure the financial, cultural governance. And if you look at the financial governments, we have in Africa a clear-cut political scheme with specific targets and goals. At continental level, we have major principles against corruption in favor of governments and democracy. Now, I'm happy to see that we have a very large, growing number of countries in Africa that are setting up these democratic structures. And this means that decisions will be taken in the service of public interest. It means also that these decisions will be implemented and that civil society will be heard. And definitely governments are ready to fulfill their commitments. And if you look now at the comparison between Africa and China, now there are only 6 countries that are in red in terms of the public debt. It is said that also China is indebted, also the US are, but if you compare the figures, you realize that we are, as a whole continent, are very far from the Chinese debt. We realize that now it is time for Africans to take full advantage of the opportunities that are offered to it. Now, there are several proposals for partnerships. We're talking about a plurality, and obviously we're talking about integration and development of inter-African partnerships. Do you think that we have to focus much more on these types of associations? Now, it has been understanding for quite some time in Africa. Way back in the early 60s, 1963 to be exact, we have set this objective, and it is the, for instance, the setting up of free trade, an African free trade area. And the agreement, as you know, is ongoing. Now, this African free trade area is a huge opportunity for the entire continent. There will be no tariff borders. There will be a free trade, and this means that we will take a leap forward in terms of integration. Now, if Africa keeps exchanging from one country to the Africa within the continent, this means, let's say, 50% of its entire trade. Well, this still means a lot in terms of development. We have countries that have not had an inflation rate of more than 2% for quite some time. Now we do have to keep on working in this direction. In order to do so, it is necessary for our heads of state to have a clear vision of what his country can do and where it has to go.
Maybe to react on what the Prime Minister just said about what is going on in terms of the ACFTA and what it's allowing for Africa to achieve in terms of growth and economic growth and development. Mr. Ichikowitz.
The African Free Trade Agreement is an absolutely huge turning point in the fortunes of the continent. It's a turning point for Africans themselves because it's the first time that we've managed to get consensus between, I think the number's 33 countries, was the with Gambia having now signed up. That's 33 African countries who actually agree on something. That's a big thing and a huge achievement. But it puts us in a situation where this continent becomes one of the biggest free trade or trading blocks in the world. 1.2 billion people. That is not insignificant. The last figure I think I saw was about $2.8 trillion worth of GDP. That finally makes us important to the whole world. I heard today that the UK is having a trade, an Africa summit in February next year, following straight on the heels of the Japanese summit, following straight on the heels of the Sochi summit, following straight on the heels of another Chinese summit. The world is starting to take us seriously. Why? Not because they love us, it's because they want our markets. It's because they want our consumer spend. And we have both a problem as well as an opportunity. And the problem is that if we don't use our joint collective negotiating power now to negotiate into partnerships, we will truly lose that opportunity. My vision for this new economic phase that we're going into is a phase where the beneficiation of our raw materials is no longer optional. By making beneficiation no longer optional, we will do exactly what Trump is doing. We will force industry back onto our soil. Donald Trump went to Apple and said, you want to sell iPhones in America, you'd better make them in America. Why can't we do the same? We then need to use the reindustrialization of the continent to create jobs. Because through the creation of jobs, we're going to solve all the fundamental problems that Peter talks about. Because people who have jobs have something to lose and typically don't engage in illegal activity, corruption, crime, and various other things. And that's my African dream, is to take this opportunity we have now, all the things that the Prime Minister have just said, and to leverage into a new economic order for Africa. But it does mean we're going to have to be a little bit tough. We're going to have to go into the UK Trade Summit and say, guys, we've got conditions too. We have to go to the Chinese and say, we've got conditions too. We're going to have to go to Mr. Trump and say, we've got conditions too. And that takes balls. And that takes us to the next discussion, which is how we create a leadership that has got the ability to have the guts to do that kind of stuff.
Monsieur Ollivier, j'aimerais que vous réagissiez à ce que Monsieur Ichikowitz vient de dire à propos du leadership et du besoin.
would you like to react on what has just been heard on leadership and how African leaders can actually stand up to in face of their European counterparts and in order to make sure that eventually the whole assembly chain will be on the African continent? Well, yes, I fully agree with what has just been said. However, allow me to say something. There is a problem. Once upon a time, it was the West that was the only purveyor to Africa. In 1962, I went for the first time to Congo Brazzaville. In 1962, the then president was Colonel Raoul, and he told me that his priority was to create a link between the port of Port Noir, that was the main entry point of Congo Brazzaville, and Brazzaville itself, the capital. Now, that was the main objective back then. We saw delegation after delegation after delegation come to the country and carry out a number of development studies. After some 15 years, when I went back to Congo, I saw that was 15 years later, the road between Pointe Noire and Brazzaville was still not ready. Again, the French got involved, the World Bank, various institutions, and we tried to get them involved for a piece of infrastructure that is vital to the country. Nothing happened. Then the president went to China. And the first thing he asked from China in 98, 99, he said, look, I'd really like you to build this road. The contract was signed. 18 months later, the road was inaugurated, a road covering 900 kilometers. Now, this is the best example I can give you in cases when partners want to impose terms on Africa, terms that Africa cannot accept. Now, this is a typical example. You see China, what it has done, and now we see that in Africa the Turks show up, and it is the Turks that have built some remarkable pieces of infrastructure. We've seen Koreans, we've seen Russians, and Europe is always lagging behind and wonders why. And just complaining that, the Chinese have colonized Africa. Well, again, it is a win-win situation that has to have the upper hand. Now, Africa must be dealt with as an adult partner. If you want to take something, you have to give something. That's my conclusion.
I would like for you to delve a little bit deeper, because we touched on it. We talked about how there is rapid demographic growth on the continent. This youth, for major part of it, is unemployed. And that is also a challenge that we're seeing in Africa. As much as we're talking about it in a positive way, you have to be able to feed those people. You have to be able to get them education and also to get them jobs. How do you see this playing out, maybe in the particular context of Angola, but more generally on the continent, in terms of what the private sector can do in achieving that?
In Angola, now we're facing new challenges because we changed the power. Yes, a new president have your agenda, your priority, but education, infrastructure, energy, agriculture has the main points that we need to facing. For this, we used to put the people at first priority, so the capital. So we need to enforce our improvement, our training in the people, because without people, everything will be very hard for us. So for this question, we are working together. We are helping as a private company. We are helping the government to achieve these goals.
Monsieur le Premier ministre, je vais vous poser la même question que je viens de...
Can I ask you the same question that I've just asked you? The African youth is an overwhelming percentage of the population on the continent, and it is this generation that will eventually take over the leadership. Now, how are we going to educate this youth? How are we going to allow this youth to have access to good jobs that will bring further development to Africa? Now, in some of our countries, youth is no longer the future, it is the present. In most countries, leaders have understood that youth and women must be fully integrated, failing which there will not be any true development. In many countries, youth between the age of 14 and 25 represent even 45% of the population. Now, we have to set up programs to ensure their integration. How? First of all, we have to earmark resources for education. Without quality education, we cannot hope to have skilled people in the labor market. We have to also understand what are the actual needs of the market and what are the actual needs of the country. We cannot have people that are overqualified in a totally different sphere in relation to the reality of the country. Third point, investments. If there are no investments, there will be no jobs. Fourth, we need to set up a mechanism that will actually meet the needs of the employers and the employees. We need to have these hubs that will allow young entrepreneurs to develop their ideas. And here, allow me to open a parenthesis. African women are way more involved in this process, and this is what we see all the tenders carried out. It is young people that are highly creative, and young women are particularly creative. Africa has managed to develop, thanks to the internet, a number of services, and this has allowed our countries to take leaps forward. Technology is widely used, way more than in Europe and sometimes way more than in Africa. Today, we see microcredits that are promoted thanks to technology, and these microcredits are fully absorbed. African banks are replacing Western or European banks. We have their presence that permeates all the continent, and clearly they are in a much better position to know the reality in the field. We have skills and awareness building, and the fact that they are fully able to accompany any investor and that will set up funds towards the creation of new jobs. Therefore, African youth is an opportunity, and has opportunities and has managed to seize these opportunities. Thank you.
maybe to react to what the Prime Minister just said in terms of what the fourth revolution is that is ongoing on the continent is opening in terms of doors and opportunities, and for that youth and the need for financing for startups and all that has to do with technology and new technology.
So again, we are at a very special time in the history of Africa. I agree with the Prime Minister. The youth that we talk of as our future is our present. If you look at kids 18 to 26 today, they are our leadership. They are our next generation. But there's something very special about this generation. This is the first generation in recent history that was not born in an environment where there was colonialism, and they were not born in an environment where there was apartheid. This is the first true born free generation of Africans. And I've been saying for many, many years that the biggest restriction to growth and development on the continent has been the fact that Africans, and I'm generalizing, but by and large were conditioned by apartheid, conditioned by colonialism, not to believe in their own capability. And this is the first generation that doesn't have that monkey on its back. And I'm very excited about what this generation will do. This is the generation that will never allow colonialism to happen again. This is the generation that will never allow apartheid to happen again. And this is the generation who was born into the digital revolution. The Prime Minister's right. There are technologies being used in Africa that have leapfrogged the rest of the world. The fintech environment in Africa is unbelievable. It's absolutely incredible to see the innovations that are coming not out of South Africa. Everybody thinks technology hub of the continent is South Africa and the future of Africa is going to come from South Africa. Not at all. South Africans have got it too easy. Solutions that are coming out of Kenya, coming out of Uganda, coming out of Ghana, coming out of Nigeria.
You did not name one Francophone country in there.
I didn't name one Francophone country.
Senegal.
Innovations coming out of Niger. Cote d'Ivoire. There are amazing innovations that are leading the way for the rest of the world. And I think that we need to celebrate these things. But there is a problem. In order for an African tech startup to become a global phenomenon, it has to go to Silicon Valley to raise its capital. In order for an African power or energy solution to become a global solution, it has to go to London or New York or Paris to raise its capital. And this remains one of the biggest restrictions to Africa's new generation. If we don't create access to capital, if we don't create an environment where a great idea out of Niger has as much opportunity of succeeding as a great idea out of Seattle, then we will again not achieve our potential.
I want to talk now about another threat and challenge that Africa is faced with, and that Africa is at the forefront of. For the past few months and weeks, we've seen international youth protesting for climate change and for leaders of the world to address the issue that they're seeing as, and scientists are seeing as, the biggest threat to our humankind, really. And Africa is at the forefront of that issue. Do you believe, I'm going to give the floor to everyone on this one, that our leaders, African leaders, and also other leaders who are probably from countries who are emitting more gas than African countries are really addressing that and seeing that Africans are going to suffer from it and are already suffering from it? Maybe I can start with you, Peter Eigen.
Well, one thing is certain. Africa will probably suffer most from climate change if the world community does not begin to take proper policy measures. And we already see that global warming has an impact, particularly on Africa. And therefore, we have begun in my organization, which is called the Humboldt Viadrina Governance Platform, to bring together 14 think tanks of the world, including South Africa, including Mexico, including Argentina, and so on, to create a system of measuring and judging the climate policies of the G20 countries, because they are the ones who are mainly responsible, in particular the rich countries, for the climate problems which we have right now. So this is something which we are trying to bring into the market in order to mobilize society to push for implementation, for instance, of the Paris agreements. And quite a number of African leaders, of course, are very enlightened in this respect. But they correctly say, we have not created this world. We are the main victims. And in that sense, I believe, unfortunately, this will be a major, major issue, including internal migration in Africa, which will probably hit the many 10 millions mark in the next couple of years. We all have to work together on this.
Mr. Ichikowitz, you said earlier that Africa needs to be tough and that leaders have to have the balls to tell, excuse my French, have to be bold enough to tell their fellow leaders, and I'm talking about, you know, leaders of the US, China, who are responsible for most gas emissions in the world, to take them seriously and to take the menace seriously. Do we have a strong enough voice to be heard? Do you feel it's the case today?
I think it's starting. I think that we're starting to see exactly that. There are countries in Africa that are absolutely at the forefront of this. I mean, you just need to take a country like Gabon, take a country like Congo-Brazzaville. These are countries that sit on one of the most important biological lungs on the planet. And these countries are taking the lead in world climate change conferences, and they are putting huge amounts of time, effort, and energy into making the African voice heard. But they are a voice in the wilderness at the moment. There are many, many other countries on the African continent that don't yet see why this is their problem. Mm-hmm. And as you said earlier, we have huge problems. Huge problems. Why, how do we have the time? How do leaders have the time to deal with other people's problems? But what nobody realizes, exactly as you've said, is that we are going to become, if we are not already, the biggest beneficiaries of the damage of climate change. And I think that this is an undealt with issue. I think that countries like Gabon, like Congo-Brazzaville, need to be joined by many, many other African heads of state who need to make this a key issue on their agenda. I do think that it needs some proper attention, and I do think that it's going to become a very big agenda item over the next couple of years. It's going to be forced on us, whether we like it or not.
And as you were saying, there are many countries which are at the forefront of this. We saw a few years ago, actually a couple of years ago, when the El Nino phenomenon happened, all the droughts that we saw in Eastern and Southern Africa, and those are other problems that are extending in other parts of the continent, and those are also responsible for internally displaced people and a lot of migration that is... sorry, do you want to react to this?
Nobody's worked... You know,
go on.
I flew over Mozambique and saw the devastation. We picked people off trees with my own helicopter. 90% of the population of Mozambique don't yet realize why that happened. Yeah. There is a massive education problem in Africa. This is just bad luck. The gods were unkind to us. But when you see the devastation that this flooding, that the consequences of climate change are creating, and when you communicate it correctly, I think we're going to have a very loud wake-up call.
J'aimerais que vous réagissiez à ce que M. Ichikowitz vient de dire, M. le Premier ministre.
Prime Minister, is the African public opinion fully aware of the impact of climate change on its daily life? Do you think it is educated enough? Definitely, the public opinion in Africa not only is fully aware but lives the consequences of climate change. Now, we have fought in order to reduce global warming. We have talked about 2 degrees less, but these 2 degrees can be translated into 5 degrees centigrade in Africa. And if I talk about West Africa, I believe that awareness has developed over a period of 20 to 30 years. The problems are common problems. My own country, Guinea, has 1,200 rivers and streams. And when you look at Senegal, Senegal is not only a country, it is also a river that has its source in Guinea. The same for other countries that take their name from a river that is born in Guinea. And all the countries in the region want to do everything in their power in order to protect these sources, and we fully understand the problem. We ourselves have a department responsible for water resources. We know that it is a resource that needs to be protected, not only for itself, but also for the importance it has in agriculture. In most of our countries, we've seen that seeds actually are adapting to climate change, and yields are also adapting to climate change. So this will definitely have a consequence in terms of the nutrition needs of our population. Now, what should we do? We should not just sit and wait. We should not just wait to see what will happen. From the smallest village to the top of our government, we have to take action. Unfortunately, the resources needed in order to counter this trend go well beyond the resources we have. Yes, I believe that this is the major problem, climate, that is. Prime Minister said so. It is not a matter of being aware of climate change. We are living climate change. Go to Lake Niger and you will see how the level has dropped, and 2,500 square kilometers are under threat of desertification. Now, we ask Africans to protect their forests, but nobody's actually giving them the means in order to produce something else around the forest. They are forbidden from cutting down trees. Fine, but they do not get some kind of compensation. They do not get a single penny for what they're actually doing to the benefit of mankind as a whole. We see the same things in Senegal, in many countries, and without any money to compensate their losses, there's not much that can be done. So we are not actually questioning the concept that Africa has a stronger position in international relations.
The issue heard on that front subverts in a way what we've been talking about in terms of the new partnerships that are ongoing with the rest of the world. Mr. Eigen?
I'm afraid I didn't quite understand this.
I'm saying, do you believe that the mere fact that we're not heard and that we're the first continent to be at the forefront of the climate threat is a sign that there are still remnants of the olden days and how Africa was seen, and it's still there, really, on that front? And that would be, I think, the last question, and I want maybe everyone to give their last word on that.
Well, I believe more generally that nation states in the north, in Africa, everywhere in the world, in Latin America and Asia, have lost the capacity to deal with some of these long-term issues like climate policies. They don't have the geographical reach, for instance, to deal with the markets which are decisive in the development of the world, with big companies moving from one jurisdiction to the other. National governments, the leaders in national governments very often have a very short-term time horizon for the motivation of their actions. I mean, they want to maintain power after 3, perhaps after 5 years, but the issues of climate change are very long-term, over many generations. And in general, one has to say the diversity of the constituencies of national governments and their power structures are very destructive to a coherent policy which will be able to do something about major issues of global governance like climate policies. And therefore, I have found, in particular when it comes to corruption, that governments have to share power with the other actors of governance, with the private sector and with civil society organizations. And therefore, I strongly believe that the answers have to come from some kind of a multi-stakeholder interaction, deliberation between these various actors in order to change things. And I have examples for that in the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, which I helped to set up. I have examples in the fisheries sector, where we are trying to improve fisheries policies in your country, Mr. Prime Minister, but also in 5 other African countries, in Indonesia and Latin America. I have other examples. So with other words, we are approaching governance, the enabling environment for the private sector to play a useful role through multi-stakeholder approaches. And this is what we are trying to continue right now in Africa, in Abeokuta, with the support of President Obasanjo, as some kind of a successor organization to the Africa Progress Panel of Kofi Annan. And therefore we are trying to bring together this kind of multi-stakeholder governance system into a global system where national governments, of course, have the legitimacy to govern. So this is sort of my approach, and hopefully Africa will participate in this. And I think there are tremendous and supportive voices in many parts of Africa. And also what I learned today from the commitment of the people sitting around the table is extremely encouraging. So I mean,
last words, please.
My final word would be, let's try to find a governance system which goes beyond the present system of national governments and their power and their international organizations, and move to a more multi-stakeholder arrangement in Africa, but in particular also globally when it comes to global issues like climate change.
One last word, Mr. Ichikowitz, just to conclude.
We've talked about partnerships, and there's a tendency to think about partnerships only in economic contexts. But this new generation of partnerships between Africa and the rest of the world are going to have to extend to everything where there are mutual issues. Not destroying the forests in Gabon and in Congo and in Cameroon has a direct effect on air quality in London. And there has to be a consequence for that. For an African government to make a decision to make 2/3 of their land mass available to remain forested against the interest of growth and development is a huge commitment, and there needs to be a consequence for that. And I think that this new generation of partnerships needs to take all of those things into consideration. And yes, I do agree with you, Peter. There needs to be a new era of partnerships, not just with foreign partners, but also partners internally in each country. There is no African government who can do this all on their own. And we do need to take advantage of the NGOs and of the civil society organizations, all of those who are not mischievous and all of those who are not trying to create regime change and all of those who really are trying to do constructive stuff. And we need to accept that that is how collectively, in partnership, we're going to resolve these issues.
Thank you, Mr. Ichikowitz. Mr. Graça, a few final words, just maybe speaking on this new generation of partnerships between African countries and the rest of the world.
I think the partnership for Africa news days, for next days, we need to take in consideration all these kind of issues that we talk about, climate, the real partnership, not like we talked before, post-colonialism, and now we have today a problem, for example, for migration. Probably this is one of consequences of the post-colonialism partnership that you have, and we need to fight this. But this is we need to find a global partnership with all systems.
À vous, Monsieur Ollivier, pour terminer.
Je suis d'accord.
I agree in saying that we have to revisit partnerships, and not only from an economic viewpoint, but also in relation to the vision we want for planet Earth. Now, we have only this planet, we cannot change it. Now, let us make sure that Africa will be on board in this action we're going to undertake. Let us make sure that Africa will bring its own experience and will give us the opportunity to keep on living on this planet. Yes, I also believe that the partnership must start within Africa. There are a lot of best practices that must be made public, must be known by others on the continent, but must also be become known to foreign countries, so as to be able to draw investments and capitals. We also need a climatic partnership, if you allow me this expression. We need to work together in order to face the challenges and implement together the solutions. We cannot just stop a storm. We cannot stop a flood. We have, however, to take the necessary measures in order to prevent as much as possible the floodings and the rise of sea levels and we have to make sure that these phenomena will not eventually be translated into mass movement of populations that will try to escape and find better living conditions. And now I believe that this is what we need to do. We have to put together all the initiatives. Thank you, Prime Minister. There's plenty more we could have talked about. Unfortunately, we do not have
this very interesting conversation on partnerships, but also economic development and all sorts of other strands of developments that we're seeing happening as the continent undergoes transformations. I'm going to try and open this discussion to the public, and maybe we'll have one or two questions, or apparently not. I'm sorry. My bad. We will not have time to do that. Mais je vais inviter donc Son Excellence, Monsieur le Président du Niger, à nous rejoindre pour...
I will ask His Excellency, the President of Niger, to join us for his concluding remarks. Let us all greet His Excellency, the President.
Merci encore. Merci à vous. Votre Excellence, merci à vous d'être avec nous.
Excellency, thank you very much for joining us. You have the floor. I would like to thank you, and I'd like to reiterate my thanks to the DOC Research Institute, and in particular its president, Mr. Vladimir Yakunin, and its the chairman of its executive board, Mr. Jean-Christophe Bass, who have invited me to this 17th Rhodes Forum, which, I need not remind you, is a privileged reflection analysis forum supporting the decision-making process of world political and economic leaders. I would like also to congratulate and greet the members of the panel for their interventions. I'm very happy, therefore, to draw the conclusions of these panels discussions on the development of the African continent and stress the major challenges and prospects. This gives me the opportunity to remind everybody that Africa has very important raw material resources, whether agricultural resources or mineral resources. It also has a huge growth potential, economic and development growth potential. Africa, as we heard yesterday, has more than 60% of untapped arable land at world level. The subsoil of the African continent has a huge geological diversity and huge quantities of available minerals. The energy potential is considerable. The Inga site in Congo has alone a hydroelectrical potential of 400,000 megawatts that is sufficient to meet the needs of several countries in the continent. Energy does not mean simply to develop infrastructure randomly. It means that we must ensure that the energy produced will not be expensive. Kilowatt hour cost $40 in Asia. In Africa, it is twice as much, and this means that we have problem in terms of competitiveness, because the products we will produce will have a higher production cost because of this higher cost of kilowatt hour. Now, Africa has currently a growing population of approximately 1.2 billion inhabitants, which could grow to 2.5 billion in 2050. This population is a young population with a huge manpower potential, as well as a huge potential in terms of consumers. The demographic transition that is ongoing on the continent will allow it to have a highly productive active population with but provided that young people are well educated and well trained. The young people are, so far, we have a lot of young people that are still in the so-called passive or demographic passive that encompasses also older people. Therefore, anybody who is not in the so-called active age of the population. In Niger and in many other countries, this is the reality, and this is an atu that we have. This demographic active, this demographic asset must be used and be turned into a dividend. And in order to do so, we need a well-educated, healthy population, but we also need jobs. And this is where, when the African demographics will no longer be a threat. Now, for the time being, Africa is unfortunately the least developed continent in the world, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. The manufactured products represent only 15% of the intra-African trade. And intra-African trade represents only 13% of trade of the continent. Allow me to remind you that when our countries became independent in the 1960s, African and Asian countries had the same economic features. Let me take an example. South Korea. South Korea was even less developed than some African countries back then. And yet, today, South Korea is way ahead of African countries and way ahead of Latin American countries. South Korea is the 12th rank of world economies. India is the 5th power. China second. Singapore, which used to be simply a transshipment counter, is today the 7th country worldwide in terms of GDP per capita. Asian countries were able to adopt strong institutions, and this is very important. They were able to adopt strong institutions that could make strategic choices, and these strategic choices were imposed on everybody. These countries were decided to stress investments and exports of manufactured goods. This is what allowed them to grow and to become the miracle we all talk about. Now, this is Asia, and yet Africa, which I remind you, as I said before, that in some cases was even ahead of Asian countries back in the 60s, Africa was chained to the colonial pact, that is, remained simply supplier of raw material and a consumer of finished products that were simply produced elsewhere. It was a victim of an unequal trade. Asian countries were able to take full advantage of the phenomenon of delocalization of Western industries that were trying to maximize profits. Delocalization is an important feature. African political leaders became aware of all this. Became fully aware of the situation. They understood that if Africa wants to take off, it must manage to achieve an economic integration and evolve within the framework of global development strategy. The economic union of the continent will become reality, will be implemented on the basis of regional blocks, of regional economic communities within which we have a harmonization process and process of political, economic and monetary integration. ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African countries, is an example. After achieved the free circulation of people and the setting up of a common external tariff, is marching towards the introduction of a single currency. In terms of strategic planning, the countries regrouped within the African Union have committed to implement by 2063 the vision of an Africa that will be integrated, prosperous and peaceful, led by its own citizens and representing dynamic strength in the international scene. This vision was translated into the Agenda 2063 and then subdivided into 10-year plans, action plans for the development of the continent with a view to transform and boost the national economies. The action plans are quite ambitious. The first is the 2013-2023 plan, and the first step is to stop the extroversion of an African economy that I just mentioned, that is the imbalance of trade with the export of raw material and import of finished goods. The first 10-year plan within the Agenda 2063 has defined 12 projects, 12 priority projects, and one of them is the free trade zone that has already been mentioned around this table. You must remember that this agreement has been widely negotiated, yet we managed to implement it within a 2-year period, despite the lengthy debates that had taken place in the past. The Free Trade Zone project means that all tariff obstacles will be eliminated so as to boost the exchanges between the 55 African countries. It will become the largest free trade zone in the world. By adopting this agreement, African leaders are correcting one of the greatest injustices that have hit the African people, and it is what we call the Balkanization of the continent, with some 84,000 kilometers of borders. The Free Trade Zone, the African Free Trade Zone, will cover a growing market with 1.2 billion consumers for starters, and representing a GDP, an initial GDP of $2,500 billion. This is not, however, an isolated project. Together with the other project of the African country, it forms a coherent ensemble in line with the idea to strengthen the regional integration and eventually attain the Agenda 2063 objectives. Now, we have a list of projects that are of particular importance. One of them clearly being catching up in terms of the IT revolution. We were lagging behind in the industrial revolution, in the oil revolution, the telecommunication was a third, and now we have the IT revolution, and we certainly do not want Africa once again to lag behind. Now, we have several action plans, as I said. We have the Accelerated Industrial Development Plan for Africa. We have the Program for Infrastructure Development in Africa. Each country has its own comparative advantages, and these will be taken into consideration in terms of industrial development. We have cocoa, for instance. Cocoa means that by actually producing chocolate rather than just exporting cocoa, a lot more will come in terms of revenue. Then we have the Comprehensive Africa Agricultural Development Program, the CAADP. Africa must feed Africa. We currently import $50 billion in cereals. Now, we have to stop that, and we can do so by developing our agriculture. Then we have the African Mine Vision and the Action Plan for Boosting Intra-African Trade. The African Free Trade Zone will thus favor the creation of value chains at regional level. All these plans I've just mentioned will create jobs. We have a growing population. We have youth that, if not channeled towards jobs, will become a menace, will become a threat. So all these plans have as their ultimate goal the creation of jobs. The African Development Bank considers that 20 million jobs per year can be created with the full implementation of the plans I've just mentioned. So by 2030, 2040, there will be 30 million young people that will enter the labor market. If by that time we have seen the creation of 30 to 35 million jobs, then you understand how the threat of unemployment, of youth unemployment, will be reduced. And small and medium-sized enterprises will be integrated within larger enterprises in order to strengthen their production capacity and export skills. We wanted to make sure that our export activities are not turned towards Europe or the Western world alone, but also towards Asia. We do not want to export raw material any longer. We want to export finished goods. So in order to face the obstacles that hinder circulation of goods and services, it's absolutely necessary to develop investments in trans-border transport, energy, water networks. The infrastructure development program includes 51 action plans that wanted to improve the interconnection, integration, transformation of the African continent, and this is an important step in the attainment of the ultimate goal. We can give you several examples of how many things that need to be done in the development of infrastructure. Just look at how much time it is necessary to go from point A to point B, from Niamey to Pretoria, for instance, or many other places. The acceleration of economic transformation, the continent through the free trade zone and the implementation of the Agenda 2063 programs will be accompanied by the development of an African financial market and access of African firms to the world financial market in order to ensure that the economy of the continent will manage to take off. African political leaders are fully aware that some challenges need to be addressed. We're talking about security, we talk about stability, we talk about the setting up of democratic institutions that can take the strategic decisions that are necessary, mobilization of internal and external resources, and so on and so forth. Among the reforms, clearly we have to look at fiscal reforms. We have to look at the mobilization of our own resources. So states must be able to mobilize 24% of their GDP in terms of fiscal policy. In Niger, we're talking about 20%, maybe. It's only 4% less. Nevertheless, it is something that needs to be done. These are resources that need to be tapped. Then we have FDIs, foreign direct investments, that also need to be tapped and needed to be drawn towards our countries. I believe that we are going in the right direction, and then we have other sources of money, and that is the transfers of money that are made by the so-called diaspora, that is our nationals living abroad. This is something that needs to be put within a specific framework, and also in order to tackle the problem of migration. However, let us look at what happened in Europe before panicking before the migration flows coming from Africa. Between 1850 and 1914, we had a huge growth of the European population, and yet at the same time it is the moment when masses of the European population left the continent towards the United States and South America. So it is not a new phenomenon. It is necessary, however, to put a stop to phenomena such as illegal immigration. And again, as I said, it is the members of our diaspora that will participate with the financing of our economic boom. We have to face other challenges, security, for instance, stability. If Asia was able to develop, it is thanks to very strong regimes that boosted security and stability. It is Singapore, it is Taiwan, it is Japan. Yes, Japan is a democratic country, and nevertheless, it is a single party that has ruled the country between 1955 and 1993. And this means that this party was able to fully implement its strategic vision. So, stability. Democratic institutions, I already mentioned it. These democratic institutions must be fully able to not only adopt some strategic choices, but have them accepted by everybody. This means that these choices will have to be legitimate choices. We need strength. We need legitimation of these democratic regimes. We certainly do not need weak democratic regimes. Now, how are we going to set up this collective mobilization within each country in order to make sure that they will be part of this movement towards a full democratic regime? This is a very important point. Finally, security. Security. African Union has conflict prevention and mediation mechanism. It is thanks to this mechanism that we were able to solve the crisis in Sudan, and it is thanks to the mediation of the Ethiopian Prime Minister, whom I'd like to congratulate publicly here for the role he actually took. Mr. Abiy Ahmed, as you probably know, is a recipient of the Peace Nobel Prize for this very role in the cessation of hostilities between his own country and Eritrea. Let us not forget also everything that has been done, huge efforts are undertaken within a spirit of solidarity, the fight against terrorism. We have the earmarking of $1 billion that were brought by the ECOWAS countries into the fight against terrorism in the Sahel and in the basin of Lake Chad. It is necessary to understand that these are the necessary conditions that will allow Africa to attain the goals of Agenda 2063. Now, reforms. Let us not forget reforms, and let us not forget also macroeconomic policies. This obviously touches on discipline, implementation discipline, and this is what we have seen in Asian countries. They were prudent in their implementation. Nevertheless, they had some outstanding ideas, and for China, let's not forget, refuses the re-evaluation of the yuan, and this is what has truly become an element of strength. Now, let us look at the management, the economic and financial management of the state budget. Let us see what needs to be done in order to contain inflation. We consider that inflation must be below 3%, and I believe that most of our countries have managed to meet this objective. So the question of the macroeconomic framework remains nevertheless very important. African countries have done a lot in order to improve the business environment. In Niger, we have really taken a leap forward. If you look at the ranking we have in the doing business ranking list of the World Bank, and we keep improving our ranking year after year. We have a lot of innovative reforms that have been introduced, among which the laws on PPPs, the reform of investment code, and so on and so forth. The current marginalization of Africa within the world economy and I'm talking about marginalization, comes to an end. I believe that in a few years, Africa will be a totally different continent, and the relation between Africa and other continents, something that we already mentioned, will be radically changed as well. We have partnerships that are being developed. We go well beyond the meetings within the traditional partnerships. Now we are no longer talking to France or the United States. We have several other partners that have appeared and set up links on the continent. We have Japan that since 1993 has launched an high-level economic meeting with the African countries, the so-called TICAD, Tokyo International Conference on African Development. The same holds true for European Union. A similar kind of initiative was started in 2000, Brazil 2003, China 2006, the Gulf countries 2007, India and Turkey 2008, Russia in October 2019. So we want to be open to doing business with all the countries, with all the continents. We do not limit ourselves to some privileged partners. Turkey, I've seen what Turkish businessmen and Turkish companies are doing in Niger. I don't know if when you last visited Niamey, our capital, how long ago it was, but if you come now, you will see a major difference in relation to the past. Russia. I'll repeat that. Very soon we will have the Russia-African Summit in October 2019. All these meetings, all these summits will allow African countries to take full benefit of the shared experiences, technical assistance and cooperation between emerging economies, emerging countries and developed economies or mature economies. We do not want to have a privileged partnership with anyone. Again, I will remind you that we don't care if the cat is black or white as long as it catches mice. So this is our vision. This is what we fully believe in. We want partners and we open it to any partnership. The class struggle was the leitmotif of Marxism. In our case, we have to look at how this has changed in China, and we see that nowadays in China it is a struggle against poverty that is at the very core of discussions, and this is why China has managed to have a steady growth rate over the past decade. We are going to take what is best from all the examples we see throughout the world, and this partnership therefore must liberalize trade and promote FDIs in Africa. They are the very proof that Africa is seen by everybody as the continent of the future. The continent that will become one of the driving forces of growth for the world economy. The emerging of Africa requires a deeper reform of political governance worldwide, the reform of security Council, the reform of economic institutions, and many other reforms. Any problem in the world cannot be dealt with without Africa. We are against any kind of trade conflict. We are against any other conflict because it will hinder economic growth, and we will suffer most from this hindrance. We are against inequalities because it will help Africa grow faster. We are against a situation in which there are millions and millions of people living below poverty level. This has to stop. This has to change, because in this way the situation will also change in Africa. We have to put a stop to commercial, economic and social injustices, because only in this way Africa will be able to progress and participate in the overall prosperity of the world. We are a global village, and we have to show solidarity to each other, and this solidarity translated into cooperation can bring us all in a win-win situation. Yesterday morning I talked about the prisoner's dilemma that shows how cooperation is preferable to confrontation. Once again, allow me to thank all the organizers very much for having invited me, and let me congratulate panelists for their input to the dialogue of civilization and these debates we've been having over these 2 days. This is the first time I participated in this forum, and I fully felt how important it is and how useful it is. However, we should not forget that we have to ensure cooperation and discussion among our peoples as well. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Your Excellency, President of Niger, for these conclusion remarks. And again, many thanks to our panelists for their input. And obviously, many thanks to our audience.